So guys, as always, I want to start tonight by answering some questions you might have with respect to the modules we covered last week and with the quizzes and review problems that you submitted, I think it was on Sunday. Now, unlike the week before, I have not posted the additional scoring for the review problems. I probably won't get to that until tomorrow, I apologize, but I will get to it very quickly. Any questions that come up for you from some of the material in labor demand, labor supply, and evaluating labor market models? Please, Ruben.
So the default overtime rate should be 50%, right?
Yeah. So that is kind of a default. Mm-hmm. So you're going to find that you should only assume that there is an overtime compensation when you're told there is, okay? Because not only do many jobs not provide it, many states don't require it, okay? So only suppose overtime exists at some premium when you're told that it exists, and when you're told that it should be defined. It's a 50% premium, it's a 25% premium, it's double time, whatever, okay? Yeah, good question. Please.
I'm not grasping the concept of a balance condition.
Okay.
I don't fully understand what that means.
Okay. So let's look at the concept for just a moment. Think of this kind of generally. Here we are in the firm, and we know the firm has two potential inputs. It has labor and it has capital. And just like we have to balance our revenues and our costs, or our productivities, marginal revenue, marginal cost, which in labor economics is going to be marginal revenue product of labor and marginal expense of labor. We balance those to reach some optimal production point. Then we have the same kind of thing with balancing marginal productivity of labor and marginal productivity of capital to get to some optimal point. Well, in order to think about those optimalities, we think about the prices of labor and capital as well, such that the balance condition is shown as the marginal product of labor divided by the wage, which is the cost of labor, right? When that equals the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital, then we believe we are at a balance condition. And the balance condition simply means we've reached the greatest utility, both functional productivity and cost utility, of the two inputs we have. Well, we can think about this graphically, but to do so it's helpful to rearrange the equation. So I'm going to rearrange this by multiplying both sides by wage, and then also multiplying and then dividing both sides by marginal productivity of capital, such that I'm going to end up with marginal productivity of labor divided by marginal productivity of capital is equal to the wage time, or divided by the price of capital. So I've just rearranged the equations, okay? Well, if we think about this in terms of budget, if you will, we have a particular budget that we have to conform to in our firm, right? And that budget curve happens to be defined, rise over run, by wage divided by price of capital. And so let's say that we can look at it in this kind of a context such that this defines our budget. Well, we know that in difference curves, which we're going to talk about later on in the term as being reflective of isoquant and isoprofit curves when we get to, I think it's compensating wage differentials, which I think is the next module after the exam. Well, we know that indifference curves in consumer economics have everything to do with tastes and preferences. And tastes and preferences are a function of marginal satisfactions, right? Well, these are the marginal satisfactions in business. The marginal productivity, because productivity and satisfaction go hand in hand in business, right? More productive, more profit, and that's happening. So marginal product of labor divided by the marginal product of capital, it gives us what we effectively think of as a indifference curve for the firm, which might look something like this. Let me try to use a different pen here to see if it's got a little bit better juice. A little bit. And this would be defined by our marginalities. We don't care where we are on this curve. The firm is just as happy at any point on the curve. But we know that the firm wants to be at this condition. And this condition happens to be respective of the zero profit condition. We've pushed our productivities, our marginal productivities as far as we can, such that when we are at this tangency, we know we've gotten as much possible productivity and profit as we could, and we're on our budget curve. Again, W over PK defines the budget curve, and for the business, when it has to do with labor and capital, and the productivity of the two inputs defines the indifference curve.
So it's finding the balance between what is possible and what is most cost efficient?
Well, they both become most cost efficient.
Right.
But what is possible in terms of productivity within the labor and or the capital that we employ. So,
Okay.
so let's take it a little further to think about how you respond to imbalances, okay? Let's assume for a moment that we have a marginal product of labor divided by wage, and it happens to be greater than the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And when it's greater than, we know we are out of balance, which tells us immediately that we don't have quite we aren't at the perfect zero profit condition. We haven't pushed these both as far as we possibly can to get the best benefit, okay? If that's the case, how do we bring this into balance? Well, let's assume we're a competitive market for capital and a competitive market for labor, which means we, being the firm, we do not set the prices, do we? Yeah. So like, if I'm out of balance, I can't change the wage because I'm just one firm in the market. And I can't change the price of capital because I'm just one buyer of capital in the market, okay? Well, so those are going to be fixed for us in terms of thinking about how to change those. So then I can think, well, what can I do? Let me change my marginal product of capital. What's the problem with that?
So long-term investment?
It takes a while, right? And I got a problem today, don't I, Bert? I'm out of balance now. So yeah, maybe long-term I can plan to make some other changes that will be yet better still, but I got to solve this problem today. Well, I can't change the marginal product of capital today because I can't change my capital inputs immediately. It takes time to raise the money or move the equipment or get the permits or, you know, any one of 100 different things that cause me to know that's going to take some time. But I can change my number of workers, which changes my marginal product of labor. So if I'm in this kind of situation, what am I going to do here? I want to make this number larger or smaller?
Smaller.
Well, it's already such that this is bigger than this. So the only way to make the left-hand side come into balance with the right-hand side, I've got to decrease my marginal product of labor, right? And how do I decrease my marginal product of labor?
Recruit more people?
I add more workers. Because I know that for every worker, after I've gotten to a point where I've, using my footprint, if you will, effectively, every additional worker, I have a decrease in marginal product of labor. So the solution to this is to reduce the number of workers, which is going to, increase the number of workers, which leads to a reduction in MP of L. Now you might have enough information so that you can actually articulate the numbers. or you might simply be asked about it conceptually. But I think it's a pretty good bet to think you're going to be asked about it.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does.
Okay. Cool. What else with respect to the module that you just finished up and submitted? Okay, so let's then start into the next one. We're first going to talk about friction. I did a lot about friction in the videos. We talked about the competition and what breaks competition. And so think of anything that takes us out of a perfectly competitive environment as being friction, okay? And think of friction, or rather a perfectly competitive environment, the only kind of environment in which we can reliably reach a market clearing level of wage and a market clearing level or equilibriums for labor, all right? So we have to think about what kind of frictions are most commonly observed in the labor market and what kind of problems they bring about for us. I want to look real quickly, I want to put a couple of equations up here to give me something to work towards. So let's see, I'm going to start with a condition of LS is equal to negative 38 plus 4W, and LD is at 95 minus 3W. Well, I know that if that's my initial condition, that without friction, I should be able to find an equilibrium. I should be able to graph this. I should have lots of good information. So let's do that, all right? So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and set them equal to each other. Negative 38 plus 4W being equal to 95 minus 3W, or 7W is equal to what? 95 and 38 is 125 and 8, 133? Is that right? Did I do my math? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, I better pull my calculator out so I don't have to keep that same. Is that right? Okay.
I can't do 133 divided by 7 though.
Yeah. Not on the top of my head. But I can do it with this. And it happens to be W star is equal to 19. 133 divided by 7. Yep. Okay. And W star is equal to 19, then I can say L star is going to be equal to, I can put that 19 into either one of the equations. I'll put it into this one, negative 38 plus 4 times 19.
Positive 38.
Pardon?
38? 38.
Is it going to give me a positive 38? Thank you. So it equals 38. So now I know my equilibrium, my market clearing points. Well, fine, that gives me some place, but it doesn't give me every place. So let me think about what my intercepts are. And you'll remember that for me to find my intercepts, I'm going to start with the recognition that my graphic in Cartesian coordinate space has this nexus at 0, 0, such that I know when I want to find LS, I can set W equal to 0. When I want to find W, I set LS equal to 0. So let me do that for labor supply. So when LS is equal to 0, then I have 0 is equal to negative 38 plus 4W, or 4W is equal to 38, or W is equal to what? 38 divided by 4, so 9.5. And when W is equal to 0, I simply have LS being equal to negative 38 plus, well, 0. So it's negative 38. So in this case, I've defined my labor supply curve by identifying its axes. Let's do the same thing for labor demand. So how am I going to do labor demand? Start me off. How do I find the intercepts for labor demand?
Oh, start by putting labor demand as 0.
Okay, so if LD is 0, then I've got 0 is equal to 95 minus 3W, or 3W is equal to 95, or W is equal to, what's that? 95 divided by 3, or 31 2/3. And the next step is to set wage equal to 0, such that I've got LD is equal to 95 minus 3 times 0, or 0, which simply means is equal to 95. So I've just identified my 4 points of intersection, 2 for each of the two curves. I can then say for my labor demand curve, I'm here, and this is 95. This is 31 2/3. My labor supply is going to come along like here somewhere, such that I know that I'm at a 9.5 on the W axis. I know that if I continued this out, it's going to end up here somewhere at a point, which point's going to be at negative 38. I typically don't bother with negative space though, right? It doesn't mean that it's irrelevant, it's just not terribly important in the kinds of simple work that we're doing. So I'm just going to get rid of it for a moment. And I already know that I've identified my equilibria, such that I've got W star here, and W star we said was 19, and L star is equal to 38. So I've given my perfectly clearing market my equilibrium. Cool. We already know that though. That's old news to us. So how do we think about what happens next? And there we have to think about friction. When you think about labor, what are the likely sources of friction or something that's going to cause this equilibrium to fall apart? Yeah, please.
Maybe exogenous forces having some sort of effect on the market.
Okay, so exogenous forces could be a labor union contract that either sets the number of workers or sets a particular wage for workers, right? What else could do this? Minimum wage, that's exogenous, right? And it sets the price level for workers, okay? So, which might bring about an imbalance. So let's just use those two for a minute, okay? So let's assume we've been given a minimum wage, and in this case, the minimum wage didn't come about by a government, it came about by a contract. So here, you've got a contract to provide construction workers to a dam that's being built in northern Utah, and the union and yourself have agreed that workers on the site will be paid no less than $22 an hour. Market clearing wage for those workers, though, appears to be $19 an hour. So we're above that. So this minimum wage at 22 is giving us some heartburn, okay? And we see the heartburn very quickly as we see that we move from 22 or rather 19 at equilibrium of 38. We can very easily see that we now have a mismatch between a number that is going to be some part of LD and a number that's going to be some part of LS. And I say LD and LS because this wage of 22 has interacted with the labor demand curve to suggest the number of workers that firms would demand at 22, right? And this wage of 22 has interacted with the labor supply curve, and when it interacts with the curve, it interacts with the equation, right? This suggests some number of workers that would want to supply their wage or their labor if we had a wage of 22. and they're different numbers, such that labor demand is less than labor supply, and that suggests that we have a surplus of workers, and we call that unemployment. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit last week. A few of you were here. Do you remember how we find these numbers for LS and LD?
Do we plug in the new wage? I don't remember.
We do. It's exactly what we do. So let me get rid of some of this so I've got some space. And if I want to find this point on the labor demand curve that gives me this number of workers, then I'm going to go ahead and use the labor demand equation, LD. LD is equal to 95 minus 3W. Well, I know the W is 22, so 3 times 22, that's 66. 95 minus 66 is 29. So that number is 29. I can do the same thing for LS, and it's negative 38 plus 4 times 22, or 88. So 88 minus 38 is equal to 50. And that tells me that out here this number is equal to 50. Now I'm going to guess for a minute that when we continue to flesh this thing out, that we're going to run afoul of, we're going to run into some problems with the fact that the slope of my curves aren't perfect for my equations. So you may have to forgive me when we get out there, but I think all the functional parts of this that we need to deal with are going to be able to be easily observed and reviewed. Okay? Well, if 50 people are willing to work and 29 are demanded, how many people are unemployed? 21. Everybody that wants a job, because remember, think about the definition of unemployment. Either have one or don't, and want one, willing to take it. Everybody willing to work at that isn't being able to, so 21 of them would in this condition be thought of as being put out of work. Okay? This isn't expressly the minimum wage like you might have thought about it at first when you said minimum wage, but it is a version of a minimum wage, right? The minimum wage we think about isn't because of a union contract or a government contract on a particular job. It's a function of a government contract with society, right? And we think of the minimum wage as a wage floor. A little counterintuitive because the minimum wage is above W star, right? It's above the market clearing. But we think about it as a floor, so something underneath. So think about a wage floor is a wage that is imposed above W star, below which we do not want the market to go. So a floor is something below which we don't want the market to go. So we don't want the market to be below 22 in terms of the wage. We'd be okay if it was above, right? We being those that put the contract into place. The union, if we're willing to pay the workers 25, the union's going to be happy, right? The union requires at least 22. If we're willing to pay workers $15 as opposed to the 7 1/4 minimum wage, the governments have no problem with that because it's above. A wage ceiling is just the opposite. A wage ceiling, which is going to have the same effect, but it's going to be below W star. A wage ceiling will also result in a mismatch of the labor market, and a wage ceiling is going to be a wage level below the current market wage. And we don't want wages to be paid above that. Please.
So the wage floor is above W star, and the wage ceiling is below.
Below it. It's counterintuitive, right? From when we think about, so you think about this, we don't want to go below a wage floor, and we don't want to go above a wage ceiling. So the ceiling keeps us from floating into the attic, the floor keeps us from falling into the basement. That kind of thing. So we'll model briefly the effect of a wage ceiling in just a few moments. So here we're looking at this, and we probably should point out a few things before we go further. This area that is above W star, below the labor demand curve, and bounded by the equilibrium quantity of workers. So above W star, below the demand curve, and bounded by the number of workers, which is this triangle right here. That area has a name. So we have to think about, well, what is that name? If we were thinking about consumer economics, it would be consumer surplus, wouldn't it? But we're not thinking about consumer economics, it's labor economics. Well, who consumes labor? Firms, employers. And so we commonly think of this area as employer surplus. For those of you that have had much consumer economics, that's a little bit counterintuitive as well. Because you think about consumer economics as about being above the price level. But think about who consumes labor. It's employers. If you're thinking of consumer economics, the surplus area we would find underneath here would be producer. But in this case, who produces labor? Workers. So this area, which is similarly bounded, below W star, above labor supply, and bounded by the number of workers, 38, is called worker surplus. So employer surplus and worker surplus. And if we have a perfectly competitive market that clears such that there is no unemployment, employer surplus plus worker surplus equals total surplus. Okay? Well, why do we call them surplus and what does that mean? So think about this for a minute. Courtney, if you're one of these workers, you're going to be following the labor supply curve, right? You're part of that aggregate effort that creates the labor supply curve. And if you're just one worker, you're willing to work for a wage that's way down here for just one worker, right? That's a pretty small wage. But because of the whole market of workers, you're able to at least get W star. So the difference between this number, which would be something above 9.5, because 9.5 is where our reservation wage picks up, right? Something above 9.5 for one worker, you know that you're going to be able to earn a little bit more than 9.5, and based upon that relationship, but you're actually going to get paid 19, and the difference is some surplus to you. It's some wage beyond that which you would expect because of your individual interaction with the labor supply curve. Okay? Well, the next worker has a similar relationship, the next, such that the area of that entire triangle, and this is a right angle triangle, okay? The area of that entire triangle is the worker surplus dollar value, because we can think about this in terms of measuring it by knowing that it's a triangle, such that the area of the triangle is base times height divided by 2, right? That's the area of the triangle, right angle triangle. So that's cool. Well, do we know the base? Well, sure. The base is the number of workers, and when we're in perfect competition and we have perfect equilibrium, the base is 38. Well, what's the height? The height is 19 minus 9.5, right? So, in this case, times 19 minus 9.5 divided by 2 is going to be the area of that triangle. And because it's some dollar value multiplied by some unit amount, we end up with a figure that's a dollar value. So this worker surplus is the dollars that workers in this market receive in the aggregate, greater than the amount they would have expected had they simply been reliant upon the labor-supply relationship. Does that make sense? Let me give a number to that. If I've done my math correctly here, and every once in a while that's a crapshoot, it's 180.5. Okay. Well, let's think about employer surplus. Employer surplus, what's our base? Our base is still the 38. We still have a right angle triangle, but now it's 31 2/3 minus 19, right, for our height. Divided by 2. Which ends up being 240.67. So when we think about total surplus, we have 240.67, is that right? Yeah. Plus 180.5. And that's going to equal 421.17. So that's the total surplus in this market, and there is no dead weight loss because there's no inefficiency or inequality. What does surplus really mean? It's the amount that workers get to have over and above that which they would individually enjoy if they weren't a part of a market. And it's that amount of profit, if you will, that firms get to keep that they wouldn't be able to if it was just one firm that wasn't part of the market. Okay? And it's the excess financial benefit that the market, as a holistic and organic entity, creates for workers and firms. Okay? If we now bring into effect this minimum wage, we know we no longer have equilibrium and we don't have efficiency. We've got some problem brewing, right? Which problem may have some benefits elsewhere, or it may have some benefits, but it has some problems as well. It has some disadvantages as well. So let me get rid of some of my hieroglyphics here, if you will. Try to clean this up before we go to the next.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So that 95 on labor demanded, when equilibrium is at 38, is that still 95 people that are in? Is that 38 to 95 gap, is that still an unemployment gap?
It's not. It's not. So if we were at equilibrium, you mean?
Yeah,
Or
so
if we're in
equilibrium is
friction.
38, but is the 95 the total that's available for work?
Yeah, so think about this.
Or are they just in, like, per se, a different job?
All this really means is firms would demand 95 workers if the wage was zero.
Gotcha. That's what they could use for their... okay.
Yeah, but if the wage was less than zero, which we don't functionally have, right? They just can't use more than 95 workers, period. Even if they didn't have to pay them, they can't use more than 95 workers. Maybe that's because the factory can't hold more than 95 people. Maybe that's because the sales market can't support more than 95 salespeople.
So
Okay.
could the unemployment of the 29 to 50 also be considered maybe just an underemployment? Like that's what the gap, or I guess the 29 to 38 is the people that...
Yeah, the 29 to 50, the difference between those two numbers, and again, we've got a bit of an issue because of
Right,
the actual
yeah.
slope. 50 really belongs
Yeah.
below 95. But that gap is the difference between the number of people that would like to work at 22, happy to supply their labor if it's being paid 22, compared to the number of workers that firms are able to employ if they've got to pay 22.
Okay.
So because of our definition of unemployment, it's anybody that wants to work and that's not working. Well, these people want to work at 22, right? And they're not being able to, only 29 of them are. So the difference is the unemployed.
Okay, I'm following. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Okay, so now we've introduced into this equation this inequality or friction brought about by the minimum wage, such that I now have to redefine the areas for employer surplus and worker surplus, and you're going to see something is left over, okay? Well, remember, worker surplus, or rather employer surplus, is everything above the wage being paid. When we were talking about it a few minutes ago, the wage that was being paid was equilibrium, but now the wage being paid is 22. So everything above the wage being paid, below the demand curve, bounded by the quantity of workers that are put to work at that wage. So this now is employer surplus. We're going to call it ES prime, just to differentiate it from employer surplus in equilibrium. Well, what do we have for worker surplus? Well, we now have an area that is not a triangle. We have an area that is everything below the wage being paid, above the labor supply curve, and bounded again by the number of workers. So now that area looks like this. Which gives us a little bit of an issue, because I don't know how to neatly value the area of a trapezoid, okay? But what I do know is that this trapezoid actually is, like all trapezoids, a square or rectangle and a triangle. And I don't immediately know what that number is, where we've now transected the wage axis, but can I find it? How would I find it?
You can take the area of the square and add it to there.
Well, I want to find this number.
Oh, that number.
Yeah, this number
Oh, sorry.
right here. No, you're okay. You're okay.
How?
How would I go about finding this?
You put the number, like you put 29 and then,
Okay, so it's coming off of the labor supply curve, right?
right.
Okay, and we know the number of workers. So let's just think about the labor supply equation with that number of workers. So we got number of workers for LS is 29. Just think of it generally as L at this point, it's 29. And we know our supply relation is negative 38 plus 4W. And we have one equation and one unknown. So we're going to take 29, add to it 38. So we've got 67 is equal to 4W. And 67 divided by 4 is equal to 16.75, which is the value at that point. Makes sense to us. It's less than 19, greater than 9.5, so it makes graphic sense, whereas our 50, not so much, right? Makes graphic sense, but more importantly, now we have enough information to see the value of worker surplus, which is this rectangle with a base of 29 and a height of 22 minus 16.75, right? But we have to add to that then the area of the triangle, which is a base of 29 and a height of 16.75 minus 9.5. So let's think about those. So I want to think about worker surplus, and I'm going to call this WS prime to differentiate it from our original worker surplus. And it's going to then be equal to 29 times 22 minus 16.5, or 16.75 rather. So that's the area of the rectangle, base times height. And then for triangle, we've got 29 times 22 minus, 19 minus 16.75. I think I have a bad number here, by the way. That should be 19, nope, excuse me. That was 16.75. This is where went astray. 16.75 minus 9.5 divided by 2. Can you see that develop? Can you see that I've got a rectangle right here, and the base is 29, and the height is 22 minus 16.75, and to that, I still have this little triangle left, and that triangle still has a base of 29, but its height is 16.75 minus 9.5. So let's calculate that number. Here I've got 152.25, and then for the next one, I've got 105.125, and together they equal 257.375. That's my worker surplus. My ES prime, fortunately, easier for me, is still just a triangle. Okay? And that triangle is going to be 29 times 31.67 minus 22 now, divided by 2. So 31.67 minus 22 times 29 divided by 2 is equal to 140.21, or 215 actually. So let's think about this. We had an employer surplus of 240, and now it's gone down to 140. Does that surprise you given the effect of the minimum wage? Why not?
I mean, overall, for even if they have less workers, they do have to pay them a lot more than they did before.
Yeah, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to determine that unless prices go up, if you have a higher input cost for labor, then you're going to have less profit, right? Add to that now, we have fewer workers than we've demanded, so we can suppose we're making fewer units for production. Our profit scenario is bothered yet more. And this surplus isn't expressly net income or profit on an accounting sense, but it's some profit that exists, some surplus, because of the market and the confluence of the market and the minimum wage.
So would it be fair to say that's like $140?
It is, because we've got a dollar denominated value multiplied by a unit value, so it gave us dollars. $9 times 100 units of something is going to give us dollars, right? Okay, so it's absolutely fair to say that. In fact, it's not accurate to say anything else.
Okay.
Okay. Well, what happened to employers or worker surplus? Well, worker surplus went from 180.5 to 257.375. Does it surprise us that it went up? Well, we didn't know exactly how much it was going to go up, but we have each worker making $3 an hour or unit more. So that doesn't surprise us it went up at all, right? They get more than they got. However, what's happened to our original definition of total surplus here? If we take WS prime plus ES prime, we end up WS prime plus ES prime, we end up at 397.95. Well, remember, the WS prime and ES prime is the surplus created in the whole market now that we have this friction, and it's less than 421. So it doesn't surprise us that the imposition of some exogenous wage, which has upset a balance in the market, perfectly clearing, perfectly competitive market, has resulted in some lower total societal benefit. we can look at the difference between these two numbers, 421.17 and 397.95. We can look at that as dead weight loss, or some benefit the market could have had we not had this exogenous imposition that now is lost to the marketplace. Okay? Well, there's another way of calculating it as well. You can either take the difference between TS and what we could call TS prime, perhaps. Okay? That difference is dead weight loss, but also we have enough information that we can articulate the value of this triangle. We know base times height. Well, base is going to be 38 minus 29 times height. Well, height's 22 minus 16.75. Is that right? Yeah. 22 minus 16.75. And we're going to divide that by 2. So let's see what that gives us. 38 minus 29, I think, is 9. 22 minus 16.75 times 9 divided by 2. Can't be right. 22 minus 16.75 times 9 divided by 2. I believe is equal to 23.625. That's the value of our dead weight loss. That is the surplus that the market has lost because of some exogenous interference in the wage, which has brought about a level of inefficiency. And we know the inefficiency is there immediately because we have unemployment. Okay, there's other ways we can see it, but unemployment alone. Well, can we test whether or not this answer is correct? And we can. If we take dead weight loss and add it to TS prime, or take the dead weight loss and subtract it from our original total surplus, we should find the other number. So let's add it to total surplus, TS prime. So we're adding it to 397.95, and I'll be darned, we end up at 421. Well, and I got 0.57 because I used a different rounding scheme. Okay. And if I had subtracted it from the 427, I'd have ended up at the 397.
Is it better to always find the area, or is it okay just to subtract that number from it?
I always do it both ways so I can figure out where I screwed up. Okay? When you have all these little moving parts, if you're like I am, a moving part is just another opportunity for me to make a mistake. Okay? Calculator, Excel, by hand or not. And so I always go ahead and do it both ways. And if I get the same answer, good to go. If I get an answer that is problematic, I can go back and figure out where I made my mistake. That's a good way of thinking about doing this on an exam, by the way. Okay. Okay. So if I asked you to define the employer surplus, how would you define it? So we can describe where it is. It is the area below labor demand, above the wage being paid, and bounded by the number of labor units that are employed. Okay? If we want to kind of think about it theoretically, it's that surplus that firms get to have. And surplus for firm, it means profit, right? It's that surplus that firms get to have because they are part of a market. And they don't have to pay this really high wage for one worker. They only have to pay the wage that the market, even an exogenously affected market, is requiring. Okay? So with that, how would I describe worker surplus? How would I describe worker surplus?
I'm struggling to put it in
Kind of describe for me first where it lives.
Okay, so worker surplus would be anything below that wage, the wage currently being paid, bounded by the labor supply and the amount of workers.
Exactly. You always know that it's worker surplus because it interacts with labor supply, and labor supply is representative of workers and households, right? We always know this is employer surplus because it interacts with labor demand, and it's firms, employers that demand labor. But that's exactly where it lives.
Okay.
And we can nice and neatly use the geometry, I think that we learned, to figure out the area of the triangles and the rectangles that reveal themselves. Okay? What it means, though, is some additional wage, some surplus wage that workers received because they're part of a market and don't have to just go at it alone. So this worker would have been willing to accept something just above 9.5, but was able to enjoy 22. And the difference between those two numbers is more than they expected to get, and that's surplus. Okay? So let me just kind of show you.
So that's worker surplus, so the employer surplus, like stated
I'm
wages.
sorry, start again, I didn't hear the first part.
So you said that worker surplus is the additional wage that the workers get because they're part of the market.
Yeah, because they're part of a market rather than having to go it alone.
So then the employer surplus is some additional amount of money,
Profit,
profit, because they're part of.
because they're part of a market and didn't have to just hire that one worker on their own. Remember, there's kind of a funky relationship here. We're talking about this and saying, well, the firm would have had to pay a lot for one worker, but the worker would have been willing to work for very little if there was just one worker. That's the reality of a labor demand and a labor supply relation. Okay? Well, let me go ahead and erase some of this and kind of start over, not with numbers, but just with graphics, so we can think about the effect of a wage ceiling. We've now looked at a wage floor, right? So let me clean this up for a minute. You wrote a ton of numbers here.
Is a wage ceiling terribly common to see? I can't think of something that would cause a ceiling.
Give me just a minute, we'll describe a few of them, and no, it's not as common, but it's not historically uncommon.
Gotcha.
And you'll understand it when you, in just a moment, you'll say, oh, that makes sense. So while I'm doing this, why might we impose a wage floor? What are we trying to affect when we impose a wage floor? Wage floor is minimum wage. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Me?
You.
Lindy.
Hi, Lindy. Sorry, you were here before, and my recall.
I'm your winner. Do you remember?
Yeah, absolutely. The book, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Is that working out for you? Have you opened it up?
I actually have.
Good for you.
Remember? I gladly took that.
Yes, I do remember that. I'm just not very good with names and faces on a one-off.
That's
I've
okay.
only seen you once. So when we impose a minimum wage, we're trying to improve the economic condition of the workers, right? That makes sense. We may be trying to do a bunch of other things, but if nothing else, we're trying to improve the economic condition of the workers when we exogenously increase their wage. That's the whole debate about the possible increases in our minimum wage. If you guys were taking the full semester version of this course, because it has so much more time, we do a series of what I refer to as Canvas discussions. You may have seen something about this in the WhatsApp chat. And one of those discussions revolves around minimum wage. I think those discussions are very rich, but they take some time to develop, and you just don't have time in the half semester format. So if that's the case, why might we see a wage ceiling? Let me show you a wage ceiling, and then we can talk. It'll be a little more obvious why it might come about. And again, I'm not going to use any numbers on this. Well, if a wage floor is above W star, a wage ceiling is going to be below W star. So let's say we've got a wage ceiling. It's down here. and it's given us the same kind of mismatch, but this time it's just the opposite, isn't it? We now have labor supply that is less than labor demand, and when supply is less than demand, we have a shortage. And a shortage is going to still be solved. If you have a shortage of something that you desperately need, will you figure out a way to go out and get it? Depends on how bad you need it, right? And that desperate way we often refer to as black markets or informal markets. I talk about that a little bit in the videos. But in this case, labor supply less than labor demand, we have a shortage of workers instead of a surplus of workers. It's a mismatch. It is similarly problematic, but it is different than the unemployment mismatch in terms of where the problem resides. Well, we know that without this wage ceiling in place, we had a nicely sized employer surplus, a nicely sized worker surplus. We had a total surplus that was not trivial. With this wage ceiling, we have to think about, okay, what's happening? We want to pay workers less than the market is paying them. If workers are making more, is it possible that they're making enough that their wages are driving inflation? Yeah. So if we start paying all of you $10 an hour or $10,000 a month, more than you're making right now, I'm pretty sure you're going out and buying more goods and services with some of that extra income, especially if it's a 10,000 variety, right? Well, if you're buying more goods and services, then you're driving up the price of those goods and services. We call that wage push inflation. We'll talk more about inflation later on in our term. Well, how do you, as a government, stem the tide of inflation? You can do it a number of ways. One of those ways being by with monetary policy, by affecting the interest rate. But sometimes governments don't like to do that, or maybe the interest rate has already been pushed so far, and pushing it further still is of no value. We've recently seen that in a recession, right? We got interest rates almost all the way to zero. Pushing them all the way to zero, which would have been about that much of a push, would have given us no marginal benefit. So maybe finding ways to increase wages to motivate inflation would have given us a benefit. Well, in this case, a wage ceiling is just the opposite. We want to demotivate inflation. If we've already raised interest rates so much that people aren't borrowing anyway, firms aren't borrowing anyway, how do you go ahead then and stem its tide further? You put in a wage ceiling. You say, okay, framers on commercial construction sites can now be paid no more than X. I know that the market right now is paying them W star, but we're going to say they can't be paid more than X. The last president to put this kind of a policy into effect was Richard Nixon, because we had rampant inflation in the Nixon administration because we had just come out of the Vietnam War and we printed so much money in terms of deficit spending in the war. So inflation was rampant, and so we had not only a wage ceiling, but we had a freeze on costs as well. And our wage ceiling that was imposed was actually at the W star at that moment. So it wasn't below it, it was at the same, but W star was moving up, and this kept W star from moving up any further. Okay? And consumer prices had also moved up, and so consumer prices were frozen, and they couldn't change, and that kept them from moving up further. Okay? That would be an example. I think we saw this in World War II when President Roosevelt was leading in World War II. We saw that there was a price ceiling or a price fixing on various goods, sugar, tires, steel, etc., because they were in such high demand for the war. And this wasn't expressly an issue of inflation. This was trying to keep the government and the war effort from having to pay yet inflated prices, even beyond the inflation that we'd already experienced. And when we saw those things happening, we also saw that most of our traditional workers, or at least a large number of them, had been shipped overseas or into the domestic military for the war effort, and we had to then bring more workers in to the marketplace, and jobs were aplenty and workers were scarce, and so wages were going nuts, and so we froze wages then too. Doesn't happen a lot, but you can see some of the effect. Largely an issue of trying to deal with inflation.
So when they do that, is it usually targeted to like specific occupations?
That's a great question.
Or is it like everybody, nobody can make more than this?
Yeah, so it's typically targeted. That's a really good question, because you can target it, right?
Right.
It's, yeah, but it's also, there's also some number at the bottom as well, but you can target it. In an inflationary environment, we're not concerned about the worker at the bottom, are we? Because they're probably making more than they had been, whether or not their productivity warranted it. We've got a scenario right now where we have very low unemployment, right? So low that we know that we're probably employing people at minimum wage or above whose productivity doesn't warrant that dollar amount of benefit. Do any of you work at Walmart? You have close family members, people you love to work at Walmart? Okay, so I can say this. And yeah, it's being recorded, so I might go to jail. But have you ever been into a Walmart and the person that you interacted with, either at the checkout stand or in one of the aisles, your thought was, how does that person get a job? How do you justify paying this person anything for standing there on their cell phone for the last 15 minutes when I'm trying to ask them a question as a consumer, right? We're employing people whose productivity doesn't warrant the wage that we're required to pay. So we've got an issue because it's such low unemployment. Well, you're going to find when we deal with the unemployment section that when unemployment falls below certain levels, that it pushes inflation. And we've been wanting it to push inflation because inflation's been so scarce in our economy since the recession. And what a little bit of inflation, as it turns out, is actually a good thing. Too much is a bad thing. Okay? Let's come back here. So in this case, we would expect that worker surplus, which remember is below the wage being paid, above the labor supply curve, bounded by the number of workers, it obviously is smaller than it had been, right? It is smaller than the larger triangle that we could think about right here. That used to be our triangle, whereas now, this is our triangle. So worker surplus has fallen. Employer surplus looks like maybe it actually increased. A little hard to tell. It is the entirety of this trapezoid, which is a rectangle and a triangle. And we know we can find that number because if we find this number, right? We can find this number by taking the newly imposed wage, interacting it with labor supply relation, and it gives us this number. We can then take that number of workers, interact it with labor demand equation, and it gives us this number. Rely on your equations. Yeah.
So there's a small space between the two shapes. Is that more deadweight loss?
Yeah, that's because I didn't draw well.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Appreciate you pointing that out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, if I stood and looked at it for a while, it might have made more sense to me too. I apologize.
No, I just wondered if that gap was more of a deadweight or
Yeah, I
something.
think that gap theoretically shouldn't have been there.
Oh, okay.
So, but what this does though, is it motivates some deadweight loss. And again, we can think of total surplus being employer surplus plus worker surplus from our original competitive condition. And then it changes to WS prime and ES prime to give us another condition that we can think of as TS prime. You'll hear me talk about in the video a couple of different ways. And I don't test you on this expressly, but you have to think about how can we observe the numbers for deadweight loss. And it's either from subtracting TS prime from TS, or it's by calculating the area of this triangle that is left. And that's deadweight loss. And we know its base, and we know its height. Okay? So both those are examples of wage impositions, a wage ceiling and a wage floor. Yeah.
I'll
Go
let you
ahead.
finish that.
No, because I'm
Okay.
about to shift gears, so
Okay.
let's do this.
So since the deadweight loss is sort of connected to the employer's area, does that mean that the employer is mainly affected by that wage ceiling deadweight loss?
Well, in this case, the employer would be heavily affected.
Okay.
Because we know the employer, which remember, we had employer surplus down here, right? And it got smaller. The employer, wait, am I saying that? No, just the opposite, excuse me. Employer surplus is up here, worker surplus is down here. Employer surplus got bigger because they were allowed to pay a lower wage.
Okay.
That makes sense. Reduce our costs, our surplus is going to go up. You might think of it very loosely as a type of profit. Okay? So in this case, yes, deadweight loss affected the employers, but I think if we ran these numbers, we'd see that employer surplus got bigger,
Okay.
but worker surplus got so much smaller that it may be problematic. So how might that ultimately affect the employer or employers generally? Well, if workers aren't making as much money, can they buy as many goods and services? And it's not just that they're making less per unit, fewer of them are working, right? So they can't buy as many goods and services, and if you're employers across the nation generally, how long is it going to take for you to feel that? As soon as you see your inventories staying on the shelves longer and spoiling. If you're a grocer and you bought an inventory with one expectation and people aren't buying as much, you now have spoilage, right? Or even if it's not a spoiling inventory, you're just not selling as much. So it'll affect both. That's why there's a loss generally. But in this case, there was more of a loss for the workers than there was for the employer. In fact, it's possible that their surplus actually went up, but their production levels went down. Okay?
Yeah.
Good. There's another type that we have to think about, and that's a labor quota. So in this case, a labor quota is where an exogenous body, maybe a government, maybe a contract, but some body that's able to have their decisions carried out, a wage quota, might be imposed. So let's say that we are in the cosmetics manufacturing business, but we happen to be at war. Well, cosmetics might be very appealing to some, but are they necessary for the survival of the nation? If you're a 14-year-old girl, you might think so, right? Okay. But if you're a rational adult, maybe you don't think quite as much. So we want to make sure fewer of them are produced, so we reduce the number of workers that are able to work in the cosmetics factories. They're able to sell cosmetics. We give a quota. And very quickly, you can see that this labor quota gives us, again, a mismatch. Right? Now, it's not going to be a mismatch that creates unemployment because, but some people probably aren't being allowed to work, but maybe they're working for the war effort in this case. Or maybe we need to have our cosmetics workers now work in the steel mills. So they probably got a job, that's not a problem for them. But we've certainly messed with this market. So what does it do? You have to think about how it affects us. This pen's running out, I apologize. If this is the quota, then workers are going to supply their wage at WS, firms are going to demand them at WD. Now there's a mismatch in wages, not in workers, right? So if this is our marketplace, are we going to have to pay, let's say we're firms, we're employers, are we going to have to pay WS or are we going to have to pay WD? Well, if I'm a firm and I can only hire the quota of workers, I can only produce based upon my marginal productivities and the number of units of production, I'm going to want to pay based upon, I'm gonna wanna pay WD. I should have done these backwards, I apologize, I gave them the wrong scripts. This should have been D. And this should have been S, because it's labor demand here, labor supply here. But I'm gonna wanna pay them WS, but I can afford to pay them WD, and so there's gonna have to be some government policy that accompanies this quota, which was a policy by itself, that dictates the wage, right? And such that we probably are given a quota and a wage. And that's then gonna help us figure out where surpluses exist, but where deadweight loss exists is obvious to us. Deadweight loss is right here. And if I am told that I can pay WS, then worker surplus is down here, and employer surplus is all this big area up here. If I'm told I'm gotta pay WD, it is just the opposite, okay? But we have a scenario that becomes yet less obvious to analyze. And it's where the labor quota is greater than L star. We gotta think about this for a minute. What if we have a quota imposed out here? Let's say that this is a market. I apologize for keep coming back to war efforts, but they're just really easy examples. This is a market for soldiers. Do we have a quota on soldiers? Well, sometimes we do, and in order to get the quota filled, we execute a draft, right? We make people work. Or sometimes we know that in order to fulfill the number of jobs required for the given efforts, we need to motivate young people to enter the military, so we offer them signing bonuses, enlistment bonuses, right? Because we're trying to meet a quota of some kind. Okay. Well, again, it gives us a mismatch, but I'm not sure I can expressly easily see deadweight loss here, can I? We would be putting more people to work, not less, right? Call this LQ. More people to work, not less. And if you're going to get more people to work, you're going to have to pay them more. That's pretty clear. Otherwise, you're not going to get them to work. We don't live in a society that says, oh, by the way, Courtney, you are now a steel worker. Show up at the factory on Monday morning, or we're going to put your family in jail. We don't do that, right? We know that there are certain parts of the world that either do or have done that, but that's just not here. It's easy to see here where worker surplus might be. Everything below the price, above labor supply, bounded by the quantity. But now worker surplus has gotten huge in this deal. It's easy to see where employer surplus is. It's this triangle. But I don't see deadweight loss. Deadweight loss isn't out here on the other side of L star. It's not this triangle. So how do we think about deadweight loss? Well, you might have to think about what policies had to go into place in order to execute this. What government subsidies were put into place to execute this? And how much did those subsidies cost? Okay. It gets a little bit fuzzy, if you will. But you can see that it exists because you've got this area now right here. And this area can be thought of as some cost because it's a wage, dollar amount, times a labor. It's a triangle, right? It's an area. And so that's going to cost something for that to take place. Who's going to pay for it? Well, probably the government that executed the quota. How are they going to pay for it? With tax dollars. Those tax dollars are no longer going to be enjoyed by the households that used to be able to keep them. So it's, in that case, it is kind of a dead weight loss-ish kind of thing. But it's got to be coupled. A quota, labor quota, never exists without some kind of a government financial remedy as well. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's kind of friction in the labor markets. Oh, we can talk about some of the competitive market conditions, and we can talk about some of the frictionalized conditions in addition. But I think that's done very straightforward in the videos when you watch them. Okay. But this is friction. Any questions?